Hello all, welcome to the show. I'm Gus Gagliardi and this is Fire Code Tech. On Fire Code Tech, we interview fire protection professionals from all different careers and backgrounds in order to provide insight and a resource for those in the field. My goal is to help you become a more informed fire protection professional. Fire Code Tech has interviews with engineers and researchers, fire marshals, and insurance professionals, and highlights topics like codes and standards, engineering systems, professional development, and trending topics in the industry. So if you're someone who wants to know more about fire protection or the fascinating stories of those who are in the field, you're in the right place. Hello all, welcome to episode 44 of Fire Code Tech. On this episode we have Paul Inferrera. Paul has had over 3 decades of experience in the fire alarm industry and has plenty of great insight on the subject. We speak about the history of NICET exams and what it means to be an engineer or an engineering technician and how these two terms collaborate. We also talk about Paul's work at the Cape Fear Community College, where he teaches 2 classes on fire alarm and boasts over 1,000 questions in help for preparation of the NICET exams. We finished the episode with a couple questions on fire alarm and a brief overview of what Paul is seeing as trends in the industry. If you want to hear more about Paul's career, go check out episode 10 of Fire Code Tech, which was Paul's first appearance. In that episode, we talk about the origin of Paul's working life, some high-level topics on basic fire alarm fundamentals, and much more about the Cape Fear Community College. Do me a big favor and hit that subscribe button and follow us on social media. Also, if you want to rate and review Fire Code Tech on Apple Podcasts, that would be a huge help to the pod. Well, Paul, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. Welcome back to Fire Code Tech.
Yes, sir, Gus. I'm glad to be back.
Man, it's been, I guess it's been, I don't think it's been, it's been a full year. It's been more than a year. I think I talked to you just after the pandemic started, so I can't believe it's been that long. I guess we talked a couple times since then, but yeah, how have things been since the last time I talked to you?
As always, pretty busy. I do a little teaching online, and I also have a do fire alarm design. So we've really been slammed with the design work, and of course, with the work comes the training. So they kind of go hand in hand.
Very good, very good. Well, I wanted to start off since we have, in case people want to go back and listen, the episode where Paul talks a lot about his background and some really good topics on fire alarm and the Cape Fear Community College. We're going to touch on some of those topics again, but if people want to go back and listen, that's episode 10, so you can get a bit more about Paul's background. But for the purpose of this conversation, we kind of talked a little bit off air about covering a little bit of the history of technical institutions and in specific NICET, since you have ambassadorship with NICET. Yeah, Paul, would you want to break into this conversation with telling the listeners a little bit about the history of technical institutions, in specific NICET?
Oh, sure. Actually, technical institutes they go back pretty far. Just after, I guess, World War One in 1918. Industrial and educator representatives met in 1923 to address the lack of technical education. During this meeting, the term Technical Institute was adopted, and that was to designate 2 year schools that offered technical education. Technician was another term that was adopted at this meeting, and that was to describe the graduate of the Technical Institute. These institutions evolved into today's community college system, and some are still dedicated to technical instruction, kind of like ITT and all those technical institutes that you see commercials for on TV. Um, Later, a study was done of technical institutes, and that was conducted between 1928 and 1930, and the results were published in 1931. And that study listed the areas of technical education that were unique to technicians, and that study was applicable for the next 25 years later at the end of World War II and towards the beginning of the Cold War that started in the 60s.
Wow, that's very interesting. I would have, don't know what I would have guessed about when these institutes started, But it's fascinating to hear the beginning of that journey. Um, about the world wars having impact. What kind of other impacts do you think like World War I and World War II played on the labor and just kind of the impact on engineers and engineering technicians? I mean, it sounds like a really fascinating topic.
Yes. Actually, I guess prior to World War One, the United States was primarily an agrarian economy, where a lot of farmers and not too much industry, because all the industry was basically in England and Europe. Of course, the World Wars kind of slowed them down a bit, and that really helped out the United States to become, or to begin to become, an industrial power. Of course, all wars in history have contributed to the advances in medicine and machinery, and this byproduct was accelerated in World War II. The world went from horses and single shot rifles to mechanized vehicles, aviation, and advances in electronics that developed radar and early versions of the computer. Of course, this equipment needed to be maintained by individuals with technical training, and the United States deemed the lack of training as a national emergency and created the war effort. These advances in technology were finding its way into automobiles and kitchen appliances, and towards the end of World War II, the government were competing with the private sector for facilities and instructors to provide training. So basically, it was World War II and all the technical advances and all the needs to produce and maintain that equipment. Basically, it was the birth of the technician.
Wow, that's awesome to hear about. Yeah, I started my career off as a contractor and getting NICET certification, so it's really fascinating to hear about the history. Um, I mean, I feel like we've talked a little bit before about some of the advantages of technical certifications, but yeah, I'd love to hear some more from you about kind of the different things you can expect beneficial to your career after you get one of these technical certifications.
Well, I think the most common feedback, and of course, in the day I was doing the expo circuits and the NICET ambassador thing, and you got a chance to meet the public and meet aspiring technicians. And like I said, the most common feedback was, well, I know what I'm doing. Why do I need to become certified? Um, but the advantage of certification is to establish and demonstrate proficiency. So, like your doctor, they may have went to med school, but you want to see a license on the wall from a state exam they passed to practice. So it generally gives, I guess, the public a little sense of security that somebody's proficient in what they're doing. And also having a nice certificate demonstrates you're proficient in your field and will enable a higher wage. Companies with NICET certified technicians can compete for high value projects. For example, all government projects will list NICET certification in their specification, and the public assures that life safety systems will work as designed and installed and properly maintained. So, I guess any certification tells two things. One, it tells the qualifications of the person holding that certificate, and it tells the public or the person that's getting those services that they're done by a qualified individual.
Yeah, and NICET certifications are similar to a lot of certifications I don't believe they have an education requirement, but they do have an experience requirement and a testing requirement. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So it is nice. It is a two-part process that evaluates experience and technical knowledge. Persons who wish to become certified will participate in a computer-based exam to evaluate their knowledge. Upon passing the exam, the candidate's experience will be evaluated by NICET. NICET offers four levels of certification with incremental experience requirements. Level 1 is 6 months, level 2 is 2 years, level 3, 5 years, and level 4 is 10 years. Upon satisfying the experience requirements, NICET will deem that candidate to be certified and issues a certificate. So you can pass the exam, uh, but of course you have to have the knowledge to back up, the experience to back up that knowledge as well.
Yeah, it can be challenging for people. I know that when I was coming out of school and I had people who were early in entry level positions and they didn't have kind of formal schooling in fire alarm or fire suppression, and so it was really kind of daunting for them to pass the NICET. So yeah, so I was gonna suggest that people who maybe don't have formal schooling in fire and life safety, um, maybe now would be a good chance to talk a little bit about. We talked about it in our first episode, but speak a little bit about your coursework at the Cape Fear Community College and how that could be leveraged if you don't maybe have the same formal education around fire alarm in order to pursue a NICET certification.
Yeah, I mean, of course, actually, the School of Life is going to teach you a lot, and that's why the experience is part of that certification. Um, but there's people, I guess, like me that are good test takers, and they could read a book and pass a test and not even know what they're testing on. So that's really why the experience comes into play. But again, those people that are well experienced, they may not be proficient on the codes and things in the book. And sometimes codes read like the dictionary. It's really dry and really boring. And so our course will kind of expound on that and give you kind of the layman's, I guess, presentation of that material. And we have two courses, the 101 and the 102, and the 101 is geared towards a nice at level 1 or 2 technician, and the alarms 102 is more design based, designed for that level 2 that wants to go to level 3 or level 3 or 4. And we'll focus on design. And but the big, I guess, value of the course is that we have over 1,000 questions in both courses that come almost directly from the NFPA codes and standards. So the feedback that we get often that these people will go through this course, and when they come out on the other end, they just realize that they're much more proficient in these codes and standards because they've taken, like I said, almost 1,000 test questions, and eventually it's going to stick. So it's a really good course, and it's been in development for almost 10 years now. So we've definitely put out a bunch of technicians.
Wow, that's awesome. You know, the number one piece of advice I give people when they go to take certification exams is do as many practice problems as you can, because the test is, uh, questions or practice problems, and the more comfortable you are with answering questions based on the criteria that you need to use for the test, and the better you're going to be at the exam. So that's awesome that you guys have such a huge basis of questions for people to get keyed into.
Yeah, I said it's one of my pride and joys because it's like you don't really, I guess, realize it, but of course you don't want to memorize things. You want to know where to find things, and that's like I said. Once that course will do is it'll get you into that code book, and if you don't know it on the test, you'll definitely know where to find it pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that's so important and something that comes in time with like experience like you were speaking to before, but also the course could be helpful with is providing that base knowledge that's kind of hard to get, NFPA can be a little bit intimidating at first, understanding the composition, the layout, and the just some of the easy tips and tricks about how to navigate the codes and standards. So I think that's also a benefit there.
Yeah, I think as far as the fire alarm technicians, the big question is, is it electrical code or is it fire alarm code? So and that's part of the practice you'll get is you'll read that question and you should be able to determine right away which code you're going to go to just from a few keywords in that question.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. Yeah, I wanted to ask, some stuff for me, a fire alarm is harder than fire suppression, but I wanted to ask, in your experience, what do you see students having the most trouble with, maybe that are just kind of breaking into it, and um, yeah, or how you've seen them kind of overcome that, just kind of struggling with difficult subject matter, or how you kind of coach them through that?
I believe the most challenging aspect is probably not even in associated with their technical experience. It's actually the taking the test or the taking the exam. Um, of course, any exam is intimidating, and the more practice you get and the more confidence you get, of course, the better you're going to perform during that exam. Um, so of course our courses online is computer based, so you're going to be in that testing environment to where you're taking a test on the computer and have to hopefully don't have to reference the code book, but our time test or will put you in that same environment that you will be when you take that computer based test. So you shouldn't feel as anxious or nervous because you did almost 1,000 questions already. So people say the exam's easy after the class, which that's probably the best, the best feedback we can get is that the NICET exam's easy because it certainly was not easy for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think you're right. I think that confidence piece is so huge. How good do you feel about the coursework going in can be big, because sometimes you'll get a huge case of the nerves going into an exam, and you might realize that you wasted time, or you weren't working the way that you should be. So I think you're right that test taking acumen and just kind of getting settled in and getting calmed down is a big thing. But I wanted to kind of circle back to our discussion on, certification and NICET, and just talk a little bit more about. I've heard you say this term before, and but it's the engineering team. I'd really like to break into what that means. I think that's an important term in our industry.
It certainly is. Of course, no one does any one thing by themselves. It's usually a team effort, and every person in that team has their role. Um, the team concept was actually defined again back in the 50s. Um, and in 1955, a paper was published that described the members of the team. It basically divided them into three team players. It was the scientist that conducts research that leads to new ideas, an engineer that develops designs, procedures, and practical applications for those ideas that were developed by the scientists, and the technician are tasked to build, operate, and maintain that equipment that was designed and developed by the engineer. Um, Eventually, NSPE, the National Society of Professional Engineers, created a committee in 1958 to establish recognition standards of engineering technicians. This NSPE committee became permanent and evolved into now what is called the National Institute for Certification in Engineering Technologies, or our friend NICET. So,
Wow, that I like hearing about that. That's so I hear people get this confused a lot, or maybe people who are not so well versed in the industry, or just getting in the industry, might not understand. But what do you see as the difference between a technician and an engineer?
uh, well, in the early stages of establishing technical training, some engineers fought the effort with fears that they would lose their job to technicians. And I believe there was one of the gentlemen that did these studies and produced these papers actually went on a little speaking tour to basically just present his report that he made, and an engineer, stood up and said, we got to stop this engineering technician thing before we all lose our jobs. And the response was, if you're doing engineering technician work, you need to talk to your boss because you're not doing engineering work. So it is a team effort. We're not going to put engineers out of business. And several organizations struggled with the definition of a technician and their place in the process. It was generally accepted that engineering technicians were graduates of associate programs in technology. However, most credentials were not nationally recognized. The first definition of the engineering technician came in 1953 and described them as one who can carry out in a responsible manner proven techniques, especially prescribed by professional engineers. The relationship was further refined in the creation of the engineering team concept, which we discussed earlier. So um, there's engineers and there's technicians, and they do their thing and we do ours, and together we produce a product for the public.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I've heard you say before, if you're doing a job and you're afraid that that an engineering technician is gonna take your job, then maybe you need to take a look at your job, because an engineer and an engineering technician are not doing the same kind of work. So I thought that was interesting before I've heard you talk about that.
Yeah, of course, in our world, it's pretty basic. Or I like to make things basic, in that the engineers, they're going to use the building codes and occupancy classifications to determine the extent and the type of protection that's needed for that structure. And then once they do that, that plan will go to a technician. And I say what I do is I connect the dots and make it work. So that's basically what I do. Is I'm not playing engineer and laying out this system. I'm just taking his layout and making it work. So can't do one without the other.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that. I've had somebody speak to me recently in fire suppression. There is a big disconnect between, what the engineer provides and what is necessary for the technician to um, construct the system. Um, but I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts about um, what the fire protection engineer or what the electrical engineer provides? Is it sufficient, or do you see gaps that could be bridged for making this engineering team more sound?
Well, um, to make it the most sound, I think that all parties would need to understand their role in the process. Um, some engineers may get their feelings hurt and think that we're doing their job, and some technicians may think that the engineers, um, don't really know what they're doing. But I think together, it's a team effort, um, because we technicians will use the code book and will apply the code in a prescriptive manner, where the engineers will use their education and that experience to solve problems, because that's what engineers do. Engineers solve problems, and once they solve the problem, then the technicians will learn those procedures and those how to do that, how to install it and maintain the systems.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You gotta work together as a team and not get hurt feelings, or about people stepping on toes. And most of the time, in the best teams that I've worked with, it's people working together, or the contractor, not trying to, or just being on the same page as a team, is makes it the best solution for the building owner and the occupants. So that's a good point. So I wanted to just we talked about the last time we got together some different topics like um, transmission and signaling for fire alarm systems, but um, yeah, I just wanted to just kick around some different fire alarm topics. I've had the opportunity to onboard a couple people recently at the company that I work with, and one of the things that I have to teach them early on is a little bit about notification device layout. Particularly, it gets pretty difficult when it comes to speaker layout, or like mass notification or voice evacuation systems. But um, yeah, do you typically use like a software for fire alarm and mass notification system layout, or you do hand calculations for the layout of those devices? It's just a curiosity I had.
Um, well, the last time I did hand calculations was on the NICET exam, because they don't let you use your laptop. But I would say, well, 100% of the time, I would use industry spreadsheets or programs that are designed to calculate the load and the draws. Of course, they do come with a disclaimer that you need to know what you're doing, and they're not going to take liability if it doesn't work. Um, but they do come from the manufacturers, so in my opinion, that's better than anything that I can produce. And you also get a nice, pretty report with the manufacturer's logo on there, and it's something that's, I guess it's gives the HJ a sense of um, confidence that you've actually done your due diligence to produce these calculations. As far as the voice evac, and that goes back to the role of the engineer and the technician, because the engineer would establish the ADSs, or the acoustically distinguishable spaces, and that's the spaces that you have to have intelligibility for the system. So they really wouldn't go around with a voice meter and tell us, what levels to set these devices at. 'Cause pretty much a lot of times they'll just show a device, and then I'll have to, do my work and figure out how bright the device has to be, or how many amps that the speaker needs to be to provide adequate intelligibility in that space. Um, there is software. I think System Sensor has the EVAC or E software that was developed in Germany, and it was actually started out as a software program to set up speakers and for concerts and large venues where you want to have a good quality sound that would distribute throughout the facility. Uh, that later evolved into a piece of software that System Sensor developed that allows you to actually lay out these speaker systems and things of that nature. Um, the software is pretty pricey. I used it once on a trial version, but that's really in the engineer realm. Um, I would believe if it was a design build to where we were working hand in hand with engineers to lay that out, I think that software would be a good tool. But basically, the engineer is gonna establish the spaces where they want intelligibility, and I'll take my code book and my knowledge of the devices to set them accordingly.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, it's just with horn strobes, it just seems like it's a pretty straightforward equation, and then when you get into mass notification and voice evac, it just is more difficult. So I appreciate you talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, I guess the most difficult thing, and actually the first step, is deciding what spaces that you want intelligibility, because you're not going to do that throughout the entire building. So if you got a mechanical space with a lot of loud compressors or something, you're not going to put a speaker in there because no one's never going to hear it anyways. So what you do in that sense, you would put a horn strobe in that space, and that would get the occupants out to an area where they could hear voice instructions like the hallway. So so say the guy was in there working on a compressor and he's seen the strobe going off, he'd run out to the hallway, and then actually that's when he would hear the speakers and the voice evacuation. So you would use horn strobes in conjunction with speakers to move people around and get them to where they can hear voice instruction.
That's a good tip. Yeah, some spaces you're never going to be able to get that intelligibility. That mention of that software, in order to model the sound, made me think of. I've done work on several aircraft hangars, and you can almost never get intelligibility in these very large, kind of cavernous spaces with hard perpendicular structures. So that's an interesting tip. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I've found um, some people, they just want to crank up the volume and blast it throughout the facility. But like you said, you're just going to get sound bouncing all around, and you're really not going to hear anything. Uh, for me, it's a general rule is that you want to place speakers in half the distance of a traditional horn strobe. So if you got, horn strobes down a hallway and you want to go voice, you would probably put a speaker at half intervals between the two horn strobes at a lower volume, so you have a nice, even, intelligible voice message going down that corridor, and not have one or two devices that are cranked way up to where it just bounces all over the surface.
That's a good tip. Yeah, I like that. So about twice as many speakers as you would have horn strobes to get that um, constant intelligibility. Yeah, I was. You mentioned design build, but I just wonder for your firm, what is the kind of ratio of how much you do work you do in design bid build or design build? Uh, just out of curiosity, it's yeah, I have my initial assumptions, but I don't know how that stacks up.
Well, our target number is zero. Um,
Zero design build.
it's well, you gotta find your niche, and we are we work under the direct supervision of a professional engineer. So we're not going to strike out our own and start up an engineering firm. And in North Carolina, recently changed things up to where in the past, we would get a job with nothing, and we'd team up with an engineer, and they would lay stuff out and work with us, and we would, do the design, and they would stamp our drawing. And here recently, the North Carolina said you can't do that anymore. If you stamp that drawing, then you have to be on staff at that firm. Um, we do shop drawings. We can't keep a engineer on staff full time because they would starve. Um, so we basically produce shop drawings. We don't want to get into that design build world. Um, like I said, we got our little niche producing shop drawings, and it goes pretty well for us.
That's okay. I don't think you're missing out on too much. That design build stuff can be really difficult unless you work for a firm that just that's all they do. So I had the opportunity to do a little bit of both, but it's definitely a different gear, a different type of project team composition.
Yeah, and you probably see those more in your suppression world because typically a suppression system's in a facility that has high hazards or special circumstances that you can't really just open up a book and say, do X, Y, Z. You have to get a risk analysis and engineer involved, and it's a full blown deal. So that's their niche.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So I'm sure it varies highly from system to system, and notification devices or initiation devices. But I never really. I'm always kind of using just rule of thumb guidance. But how many devices typically do you see on like each notification appliance extender panel? I always kind of use 50 as a rule of thumb, but I never get to do the actually calculations. I mean, I review the calculations, but yeah, I don't know if you had some anecdotal information on that subject.
Yeah, again, that would be the role of the engineering technician. So um, it really depends on the manufacturer. Um, I guess for 50 devices, you probably think about a four circuit, power supply. That's probably about, I guess, 6 amps. So we really never see the power supplies on a project. Typically, they won't even tell you where the panel is going to be, and you'll work with the installer and the owner to establish those locations. Um, but with the new LED devices that are out, they consume much less power. So back in the old days of 50, that's probably going to turn into maybe 100. Um, but it's not only the load; it's also the voltage drop. Um, you could have 50 devices, but if they're running a mile, you're not going to run all those devices on that circuit because you're not going to have enough voltage. You got enough power, but you don't have enough voltage. So that's really what the technician is going to do, or we do, is we just, like I said, we connect the dots and we make it work. Um, and pretty much 9 times out of 10, I can lay these things out and won't get in trouble. It's that 10th time that you make an assumption and then you actually do the calculations and get burnt. But yeah, I think you're good with that ballpark, and that's a good starting out number. But like I said, until you actually get into the calculations, um, and see that's when your results will come out. Um,
Yeah, no, I appreciate that piece of guidance. That definitely helps me have some more information to make decisions on thinking about length of run and thinking about how close the notification extender panel or the original fire alarm panel is from the most remote devices. It's something to take into consideration. So yeah, it's interesting too. You were talking a little bit about the laws where you work at, and how that kind of influences the role of the engineering team, and the composition. I thought that was a great point, and how knowledge about your state or your legal entity that kind of governs um, the different roles is really important in what you're allowed to do as a professional.
Yep, and of course that's driven by the engineer because I don't get those memos, and that actually came from the North Carolina Board of Engineering Examiners, and I believe what prompted that action was that some engineers will stamp a napkin if you pay them, and of course they don't look at it or don't do whatever. So I think that's why they came up with that requirement to have both those people in the same under the same roof, because I guess in that sense they're not just stamping a piece of paper, they're actually working with the technician or working with the design firm to actually lay these systems out. um, and that really you find those on the smaller projects, and we'll see them. Let's say somebody, that there was a residence that was zoned commercial, and now that house is now a daycare, and they go in and they want to turn this house into a daycare. um, well, what they would have to do is get an architect and an engineer and lay all that stuff out, and then come to us and let us do the shop drawings. And $10,000 later, they got a nice fire alarm design for a small business. So it's that financial burden that's going to put that small project or that small structure. Um, I guess it's going to price them out of a fire alarm system, and that's not really good when the cost is your deciding factor on protection.
Yeah, usually cost is one of the main factors, that you're always fighting against, even for fire and life safety, which is remarkable as people who install systems to help save people's lives, that we're still, paring stuff down to just the fewest nuts and bolts we can have, just to the absolute minimum of what the code allows. And they're still, you know, shaking us for not using any more conduit than we absolutely have to, or getting the pipe schedule down to the thinnest that you can. So yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying about price being a big factor.
Yeah, many years ago, I went out on a. I was playing technician then, and I had to go out. I guess we had a client. Their insurance company came in and told them they had to get a fire alarm system, or else they're going to raise their premiums. So they wanted me to go out there and kind of just see what would be involved in putting a fire alarm system in. And this place produced wooden signs, so they did a lot of woodworking and had lathes and sanders and stuff. And at one point there was a pile of sawdust in the corner, and I know my days of woodworking that sawdust is almost explosive as propane under the right conditions. So we went in, did our little design, gave them a price, and I think it was probably maybe $6,000 maybe for the system and everything. And they said that it'd be cheaper to pay the premium on their insurance than it would be to put the fire alarm system in. And I just said, okay. So, I mean, they made the choice to pay a couple $100 a month extra and risk having their place burned down, but I guess that's the choice they made.
Man, that's kind of sad and disheartening to hear that business owner would choose to that. But I guess it's just like you said, it can be cost prohibitive, these systems, and in getting engineers and or technicians on to install. But yeah, that's a little bit disheartening. I mean, I understand the expense is not small, but on the scale of a lot of the buildings that I'm working on or that I've worked on in the past, $6,000 is pretty small compared to what other trades have to pay to get their systems installed, to HVAC or some of these other kind of more widespread disciplines. That's fairly inexpensive.
Yeah, but not to consider the loss of life and property when there's a fire. If you get sued by an employee's relative because they died in a fire, that's gonna be a lot more than $6,000.
Yeah, yeah, without a doubt, without a doubt. Well, Paul, I know one more time we should plug Cape Fear Community College, and another benefit that we talked about before, but just thought it'd bear mentioning again is that it comes at a very, very reasonable price for people who are looking to get some continuing education credits or want to buff up on their fire alarm skills for the NICET exams. But yeah, yeah, I think that's a great deal.
Yeah, we don't like to name names, but if you compare our cost per CEU to all the industry training on the market, we definitely have them beat hands down. Our 185 for our course will give you 14.4 college credits, and if you're going to use that for your NICET, that's 45 NICET points real quick, and then you've learned something in the process. And of course, your engineers can use those for PhDs as well, or PDHs. So we even train engineers.
Yeah, that's a good deal. I still need to sign up. I was telling you last time, but I'm still serious about getting in there and learning something myself. I'm sure that I got plenty to plenty to buff up on.
Well, we definitely will hurt some engineers' feelings, but that's the whole point is that's not their job. Their job isn't to know all the nuts and bolts of the fire alarm code because that's what we do. So, um, I worked at a company. We had a FPE on staff when I was developing the curriculum, and he took a couple test questions, didn't do very well, but like I said, he's an engineer. He wasn't a technician. So, just Google FAST at CFCC, FAST at CFCC, and it should pop up at the top. And check out our website, and we'll definitely take you in April when the next class starts, our next semester.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, Paul, what kind of, to round it out for the end of the podcast, what kind of other trends have you been seeing in the industry? I know that it seems like we can't shake this COVID business, but what else are you seeing in trends with work? I know we've talked about things being abnormally busy around the end/beginning of the year, like you were saying to me on air at the beginning of the podcast. But what else are you seeing?
Well, we're definitely seeing a lack of qualified personnel to install and maintain fire alarm systems. So I guess, like I mentioned, a lot of that COVID money was being shifted over to capital projects, and we probably have more schools and colleges than we've had in 10 years of doing design work. So if you want to do fire alarms, there's definitely work out there, COVID or not. Fire alarm people are essential employees, but I think we're past that essential pandemic hysterics. But fire alarm technicians are in demand for sure.
Yeah, I've been seeing across the board. It seems like there is just an absolute vacuum for people needing qualified professionals, like you were saying. It just seems like everybody I'm talking to says, "Yeah, we can't find enough people to do the work. We can't find enough people to hire." So I'm definitely seeing that on my side too.
Yeah, and between me and you, if they keep waging the wages, I might just quit my job and go back to installations. Uh,
That's pretty funny.
much less stress.
Much less stress. Just pulling wire and putting fire alarm devices in.
Yep, yep.
Sounds good. Well, Paul, anything else you'd like to talk about before we end it? Where can people find you at if they want to learn more about Cape Fear Community College or Drawfire LLC? I'll drop some links, but plug anything you got.
Sure, just Google it. They know where we're at. You can't hide from the big brother. Um, but yeah, just fast at CCC or Google the program, and it'll definitely pop up there for sure. And
Well,
some on
Paul,
LinkedIn as well, so it's hard to hide.
sounds good. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on the podcast again. And yeah, it was good talking to you.
Yes, sir, Gus. I appreciate the invitation, and we're always glad to share any knowledge and experience we may have.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.